Most of the interviews in this series focus on a particular invention or technical solution. But some people whose goal is to address big global problems or opportunities end up contributing to a whole ecosystem of innovations and spend their time addressing the underlying conditions for change. In this episode, I'm talking with someone who's doing just that. Her goal is for the world to move in a direction that is more inclusive of different kinds of human minds. What does it take for us all to value cognitive diversity and see it as a competitive edge? And what kind of person has the motivation to try and change whole systems of education and employment? Let's find out.
You're listening to The Innovator's Journey, a podcast about the lives and careers of creative people, technology, and the future of work, with your host, Jonathan Winter.
Maureen Dunne, hello and welcome to The Innovator's Journey.
Thank you, Jonathan. Really happy to be here.
So to introduce yourself very briefly, how would you describe what you do and why it matters?
So I've been working in the neurodiversity field for over 2 decades. I think especially in the economic context that we have in front of us, including cognitive diversity in different kinds of minds is more important than ever. We need unique problem solvers, and it's always been important to be inclusive of cognitive diversity, but I think particularly when we're looking at the future of work, that this is critical to our collective future.
Great. I'm excited to be talking to you about the potential contribution that neurodiversity can bring to the world and the world of employment. Now, as you know, this podcast is called The Innovator's Journey, so I'm keen to start by hearing about your personal and career journey. Where does the Maureen Dunne story begin?
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like our own personal stories always end up ultimately being the kind of stories we tell ourselves, and they end up being the ones that we have the strongest emotional connections with. And for me, anyway, it's a little bit nonlinear. You know, a lot of images and emotions come to mind. And the strongest images I think about is I started out from a very young age being really interested, almost obsessed with music. And, you know, I was actually competing at a high level as a pianist starting at the age of 4. I also loved reading, loved books. I was a very early reader. I was reading fluently at the age of 3. But, you know, at the same time, I think for any innovator, the journey's never a linear line, right? You know, we always think of it like, hey, we want to, you know, go from A to B. But I think that, you know, that's just too simplistic.
I'm intrigued that you started your description there with music, actually. And I find it fascinating, the influence that music has on people. Despite the fact that not many people become professional musicians, it's still really impactful. Tell me a tiny bit more about that.
I've just had a passion from a young age, and I saw it, I guess, as a form of communication in a way. There's so many things that are so important that we communicate, you know, with each other in humanity that can't really be said in words. I was doing some compositions as well, and I very much have a strong visual thinking. So music sometimes inspires a sort of visual, spatial, colorful type of experience for me as well, which is consistent with like synesthesia. And so, yeah, so it's been a real passion. And I think even though I ended up going in a different direction, ultimately, you know, professionally, my love for music helped shape my interests, helped shape who I ultimately became. And also just there's a lot of evidence for early brain development that children that are exposed to music from an early age, that it does shape the brain in some important ways too.
When we talked previously, you told me a little bit about your education, and I think you used the word struggled. So you said you struggled at high school.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, for me, that was a difficult time for a lot of reasons, but I'd always been an honor student and I was ahead, but then in high school in particular, I kind of struggled to fit in, and it wasn't the easiest time in my life. And I ended up actually graduating then as a junior in high school, and then was in an honors program at my local community college.
Okay, so you graduated early from high school and went
Right.
to community college.
Right. And it was actually there then that I really felt like I found the path that I've been on since then, you know, sort of my life's work. And I've had some really extraordinary mentors that really understood me and believed in me and helped me find that path.
I think you told me it's quite rare for people to go from a community college to some of the top higher education institutions.
Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting is I don't think enough students understand that it's realistic and it's possible. So I actually I'm a trustee now at the same community college I got my start at. And I've been president of my state association for community colleges, and I'm involved at the national level. And it's something that I think is important for people to realize is that you can start at community college. You could transfer to anywhere, University of Chicago, Cornell, Harvard. And then I was also very, very fortunate to be the first community college graduate to be named a Rhodes Scholar as well and go to Oxford, which I think is pretty unusual.
Fabulous. So there's a list of really top institutions now on your resume. Chicago, you mentioned MIT, LSE, Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. Amazing. As you look back and think about what enabled you to do that, you've mentioned the people that helped you. Is there anything else that was formative?
Well, I think it was around the time I was about 17, 18. I see that as a really important period in my life. And, a lot of it was I had good mentorship. I felt like I had people that were supporting me on the journey. But there was also just this very intense instinctive need to make a positive impact in the world. And it's hard for me to know exactly where it came from, but I became more self-aware around that time. And a lot of it probably does have to do with some of the family challenges, going through my mom's terminal illness, right, from such a young age. And then losing my dad, pretty young too. And sort of maybe going through things a lot of people eventually go through, but going through them at such a young age, I do think it definitely changed me and made me a much, much more adaptive person. And then also when I was in Oxford, I'm totally fine now. This is many, many years ago, but I had gone through cancer myself at the time. And so just all these experiences together, I think it's really reinforced from a young age, realizing that nothing's guaranteed and wanting to do things that are meaningful in my life and, investing my time and energy in projects and initiatives that could make a positive difference, even after I'm gone, right? It's like just being more aware of it's not about me.
And you've come to focus on neurodiversity. When did you first become interested in cognitive diversity?
When I was a teenager, the same formative time period we were talking about, I had some really powerful experiences with some children, especially some autistic children. There was one girl, for instance, that was supposed to be institutionalized, and I was very fortunate to be part of a team working with her, connecting with her, and seeing her progress way beyond what was predicted and realizing that we don't understand, this was a while back, but realizing that we don't understand everything about the brain and neuroplasticity, and nothing's as fixed as people maybe thought at the time. And then also just I've had a lot of personal experiences. I mean, I'm an extremely nonlinear thinker myself, so I've always identified with the community myself, and my family's majority neurodiverse as well. So, and then we took on a foster child who had a lot of support needs.
I think you said he didn't speak at all, is that right?
Yeah, he was 6. He very, very bright little boy, but, a very visual, spatial thinker. But he's, when we took him in, his father had committed suicide in the military, and his mom had, some challenges. So he didn't have anywhere to go. If we didn't take him in, he actually would have been institutionalized, and he was still in diapers and on speaking, at 6. And so we kind of made it our mission. And I was really impressed with my husband because this really isn't his field, right? He's in finance, but he was there as a partner with me, changing his diapers at 2 a.m. And he did, we were really happy. We think we made a difference in his life because we were in part of the process of teaching him a picture exchange communication system, PECS, and, he was learning some sign language, and he became just much more calm. And then it was sort of a positive story because then we helped his mom started to get her act back together. And so we all worked together to make it possible that he could transition back to his biological mom with a team supporting him.
Hard work and very rewarding, I imagine.
Yeah, for sure.
What was your professional training in this area?
So as a teenager, I was already working with teams, more in home-based programs and, working with kids. But then as my career progressed on, I started to focus more on adults just because I had so many experiences with kids that had actually ended up adapting pretty well, but then still sort of falling apart in high school and in the world of work. And it's getting so much better now, but there was still even a lot less funding and support for the adults, even though that's so important, right? To find meaningful employment, finding a place that's in the world. But in terms of training, I mean, I focused my PhD when I was at Oxford in this area. My doctorate is in the cognitive sciences, and I focused primarily on neurodiversity, specifically autism at that time.
Can you help me to understand a bit more about neurodiversity itself then? Let's move on to that as a topic, if that's okay.
Sure. So I'll have to start out by saying, like, when I first was really heavily involved professionally in this field, most people didn't even know what it was, and if people had any concept of neurodiversity or autism, they think of like Rain Man, right?
Let's start there with what is it? Because, I mean, I'm thinking of autism, obviously. What else? How do you define it?
Neurodiversity is much broader than autism. And so, like, just to go back in history, the term was coined by a sociologist named Judy Singer back in the late 1990s. And the idea was that we didn't have to see it purely as a medical perspective, where there's some people that are just normal and other people that are just deficient. There's a rich diversity of cognition, and that we should appreciate and celebrate that diversity, and that should be seen more as the normal variation of the ways in which the brain works in the human population. So that was kind of the idea. And neurodiversity encompasses far more than autism. ADHD, most people refer to themselves as ADHDers. People that are dyslexic, dyspraxic, hyperlexic, have synesthesia. So any sort of unique cognitive profile would call themselves neurodivergent. But the important thing is that neurodiversity as a whole is about appreciating the full spectrum of the different ways that human cognition can manifest themselves, and that includes neurotypical and neurodivergent profiles.
So
and to value that.
If someone describes themselves as neurodivergent, what does that actually mean? What proportion of the population are neurodivergent? Do we know?
Yeah, so the statistics currently show that, it's actually a pretty large proportion of the world population, at least 15 to 20% are neurodivergent. However, what's been very intriguing is there's been some recent studies, including one by a survey by Zen Business, that showed that if you look at the Gen Z population, and I don't know if this is, diagnosis or more identification, but about 50% of Gen Z identifies with some aspect of being under the neurodivergent umbrella.
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Because I guess if we're moving from what was originally a kind of medical model, we're talking about diagnosing people with a condition of some kind, which then gets a label. And now we've moved towards something where 50% of the population identify themselves as neurodivergent for whatever reason. It's very different, isn't it?
I think where there's consensus is that we should be seeing any cognitive differences in a strength-based light. And that doesn't mean that, legislation like the American with Disabilities Act, that's still incredibly important and part of this equation. But the idea is at least that we are, regardless of support needs, we are appreciating and valuing cognitive diversity. But I would also add that it's still an evolving concept, neurodiversity. So some people see it as including mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. And other people see it a little bit more about cognitive, learning differences. So there's also that debate. And, that's an evolving concept, I guess, going on as well.
Yeah. Maybe the thing that's disappearing is the idea of normal.
That's true. And especially, looking at where we're going in the future work, that's maybe the best or the only path to helping us solve some of the world's biggest problems. So
Right. Interesting. We'll come on to that.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the definitions and so on and how these things have changed. What practical difference does that make? If I'm running an organization or a school, or if I'm a parent, do all these definitions make a difference, or is there just some wisdom that basically we need to adopt?
I think for organizations and companies, the most important thing is that there's this shift in mindset, right? Where we're valuing, unique strengths, and there's a lot of people in the world that maybe, have more spiky profiles, right? So most neurodivergent people, however they're defined, tend to have what we would call more spiky profiles, where they might be exceptional in certain areas, but have more challenges than others.
Yeah, great. We're going to come on to talk about your work in a moment. Before we do, we've been talking about your journey in life and career and what led you to the work on neurodiversity. How do you make sense of that if you look back at your career so far?
Yeah, I think I've evolved a lot from where I started. And, as we talked about, it hasn't been a straight line, right? I've had a lot of disruptions. And then also one thing we didn't talk about, I ended up having triplets, right? That they were born at 28 weeks.
Wow.
Still having a super complicated career, and they're awesome. I love them. It's not a typical thing, right? So the two girls are identical, and then I have a boy. They're going to be turning 7 in March.
Okay, so this is part of life not being a straight line, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think I guess I remember when I was younger thinking I could chart out my my career, and I had a little journal, what my goals would be. I want to do this by this date, and everybody, I think does that to some extent. And it was like, I look back and I realize, like, if I had stuck to that plan, I wouldn't have become who I am now, right? And I guess looking back, it was just letting go a little bit of these very rigid expectations of myself, and instead just focusing on, hey, life is never guaranteed, and what really matters. And that kind of grounded me in always trying to make decisions every day that were consistent with what was most important to me. And so I think it was just a different process. Yeah.
It's a very different approach, isn't it, to life and career. Great. Well, thank you so much for describing your personal and career journey. Before we talk about your innovation and the work you're doing right now, I asked you to think of an artefact that represents your creative journey. Have you chosen something that's a creative artefact?
Yeah, so I have some paintings that I've done myself and things like that. But I think where I'm at now, I had chosen actually a specific image for the cover of my upcoming book, The Neurodiversity Edge, which it's a butterfly, but it's kind of digital butterfly that's combining different individual colors and different square shapes. So that are together collectively trying to create a transformation in the world. And I think that where I'm at now, like the stuff I'm trying to do, I can't change the world by myself, right? Like, I can do my part, but it's really about joining forces with like-minded people, with industry leaders, with political leaders, with people that understand where things are going, and together trying to create the kind of change that we need to see in the world. And so that image, to me, it's why I chose it for my book. And it's almost like an ink blot test a little bit, but it creates an image of a butterfly.
The whole is greater than the parts, the colourful parts.
Yeah, for sure. Yes.
Maureen, we'll be back shortly to talk about the work you're doing now, and we'll talk about the future of work.
You're listening to The Innovator's Journey, a podcast about the lives and careers of creative people, technology, and the future of work, with your host, Jonathan Winter.
Maureen Dunne, the innovation we're featuring today is your work on neurodiversity. Tell us, what is the problem you're solving or the goal you're working towards?
There's millions of people around the world that have unique skills that have not really been able to self-actualize. There's many neurodivergent people with amazing college degrees that still struggle to find jobs. So yeah, I think I would define the goal I'm working towards as the gap problem. I've been focused on these periods of time where there's just increased vulnerability to transitioning to a successful next step. And so there's a couple different periods of time. High school to college is one of them, but also college to the world of work, or transitioning to successful entrepreneurship or apprenticeship. So it's sort of, I look at it holistically.
This affects the whole of humanity, doesn't it?
I believe so, yes.
It's a big goal. And I used a phrase, I think, when we spoke last. You said that the purpose of what you're doing was for the world to move in a direction that is more authentically inclusive of different kinds of minds, which I think was a lovely phrase to use. And
Yes.
the challenge for the innovation and the innovator is how to make that happen. And you've been involved in lots of initiatives. You were telling me about the Autism Angels group, angel investors, that is. You're a senior advisor to the Lego Foundation, which includes a $20 million accelerator program called Play for All. Do you want to tell me about those very briefly?
For instance, for the Autism Angels group, so we're a social impact investment group, and we've invested in a number of enterprises that are innovating in the space. What's been really interesting for me also is that we have a nonprofit arm, and I co-founded a program called the Neurodiverse Entrepreneur Program. And the first pilot was with Innovation DuPage. And what's exciting about that is there is actually a pretty high correlation, especially with ADHDers and people with dyslexia and also autism, where entrepreneurship is a very instinctive option career-wise. And then there's also a number of neurodivergent people that actually, unfortunately, tried to get more traditional jobs, and it just didn't work out, even though they were extremely skilled people. And so entrepreneurship then ended up being the vehicle that they pursued their goals in a meaningful career. And so this program is a non-dilutive grant where we're funding social enterprises that are specifically committed to including neurodivergent people in a meaningful leadership role. It could be the founder CEO, it could be the CTO, it could be some other role. And then with the Lego Foundation, that's been a really unique program as well, because there's so few opportunities out there where there's funding for social enterprises and companies that are equity-free grants. And the idea there, it's a little bit different than what we're doing at the Autism Angels group, because the focus is more on children and families.
So the product and service of the business needs to be focused on children and families, is it?
Yeah, and consistent with the mission, the Lego mission of innovation and play-based solutions, providing support and funding and connections to these social enterprises that are developing world-changing solutions and innovations that maybe traditional VCs aren't quite as interested in, or maybe they would be, but it just takes longer to prove the concept, because in this field, being evidence-based is extremely important, and it just takes longer to prove out that case.
Can you think of an example of one of those businesses then?
Yeah, there's many. One interesting one is Social Cipher, who's I think over a 50% neurodivergent team. And they're focused more on teenagers and young adults rather than small kids. But it's a game, a sort of a 3D world where teens are learning to find social acceptance and work through different kinds of challenges that they might go through socially in that world. But then also Lego funded some publicly traded companies, much later stage companies like Kahoot. They're a publicly traded company in Norway, and they're really committed to neurodiversity, but they weren't really doing a lot in this space before getting accepted into the Lego program. And so, they've been now rethinking their platform and developing new solutions that will specifically meet the needs of neurodivergent teens and families. And so I think that was kind of cool too, that, when you have a platform that already has millions of people on their platform, and then just sort of taking a step back and thinking through their design and, creating new modules, creating new ways of doing things to be more inclusive.
Real potential for impact at scale there. And with some of those you were describing, the team are majority, perhaps neurodivergent. Does that mean that they need some kind of special conditions to help them thrive as an organization, as a team? I mean, your model is about, I think you described it as wraparound support.
My wraparound support program that was initially developed for teens transitioning to college and then apprenticeship programs and work. Also, there's been an adapted version for entrepreneurs.
Okay, yeah. Can you help me understand what's in that wraparound support?
It's based on the principles of universal design. So there's a menu of options that would apply to just helping everyone thrive. But, I do extensive neurodiversity friendly training so that it's not just the neurodivergent people that need coaching and support, but the whole organization starts to learn how everyone can just develop a little bit more empathy. And we do a lot of like perspective taking exercises and trying to bridge those gaps in understanding.
What's an example of what we might do?
The perspective taking, I think it's helping different team members really come to terms with that their first assumption about a situation may not be correct. And like one example I bring up in my book is a real life situation where there was an autistic employee who had a lot of sensitivity to auditory stimuli and became overwhelmed by noise. And she had thought she communicated that, and we had just had some trainings about sensory overload and neurodiversity. And there was an employee that when she had said her ears were bothering her, that the air conditioning was a problem, that he interpreted it because he was too cold himself, that that it was more about heat, right? And, so then he went to the manager and said, hey, let's, but it was an old system. And so by making those changes, it actually made it louder.
Made it noisier.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so then there was like this total misunderstanding. And
what can we do to prevent those misunderstandings then? What's the sort of key lesson?
A lot of the times people are well-intentioned and they just need more education, and then sometimes things just kind of click into place, and especially managers, so that they're more aware when these situations do come up to make sure that they have the knowledge so that everybody can thrive.
Fantastic. Let's move on to the final part of our conversation, Maureen, which is about the future of work. And we've hinted at it before, haven't we? And I'm really keen to talk about where you see the future of work going, where the recognition of neurodiversity might have a place to play. And I'm also, as you know, quite interested in technology and the way that's changing the world of work. So, what's your vision for the world of work in 5 or 10 years' time?
Yeah, well, as you know, this is a sort of unprecedented times where just the speed and pace of change is way, way, way beyond what we've experienced in the past. And I think we're also in a unique time in history where this is the first time where cognitive work is going to be taken over by machines, right? And where specifically AI is going to be transforming the way we work, the way schools educate. I mean, really every profession, every facet of our daily lives. And I believe strongly that all companies and organizations should be actively recruiting for cognitive diversity. There are very unique special skill sets that neurodivergent people bring to the table that, in my opinion, are very, very difficult for AI and machine learning to replicate.
And that's interesting. What sort of things are you thinking of?
Well, very unique visual spatial skills, nonlinear thinking, connecting dots between different fields and different pieces of data and information, and these sort of leaps of intuitive, creative insight. I mean, AI is, especially when you start getting into more advanced AI and the sort of combinatorial effect that will inevitably happen with quantum computing. I mean, the level of data processing that's going to happen is really kind of scary and extraordinary in terms of like data crunching and linear thinking that can happen. Things that could take many, many years for human beings to do will happen within minutes, if not seconds, right? So, but there's certain types of domains in human cognition that really are outside that map, and
that's interesting.
Sort of, a lot of ADHDers come up with extremely creative ideas that could be really a good fit with working alongside AI. And so who knows where things will be in the far future, but the current state of where our technology is at, it's not really capable of the same kind of intuitive leaps of creative logic or, combining sort of experiences that someone may have that are very sensory with factual knowledge and...
Because the machines only have the data that they're trained on, don't they? They don't have other data.
Correct. One of the examples I give in my book is, you could train an AI system on lots of different examples in classical music, but it would never produce something like the Moonlight Sonata, right? And I think that especially if you're a CEO or you're a manager or a board director of an organization, if you want to be competitive and innovative, you need to include people who are different, who who are thinking about problems from different angles, and that inevitably overlaps with neurodiversity.
And you talked about CEOs and senior leaders needing to think about that. What practically do organizations need to do or think about as we move towards that future of work that we've been talking about?
Well, I think the first step is, committing to valuing a more value-driven perspective to diversity and inclusion, right? And if you're serious about including cognitive diversity, first committing to it and then going through this process to make your organization a neurodiversity-friendly place to work, which will not just benefit neurodivergent people. Everybody will thrive. If you go through that process, everybody will be more productive and will thrive.
I love that universal benefit that goes with universal design. That's great. Thank you. My closing couple of questions for you, Maureen, then. If you're looking back on your whole career and you were to give wise advice to your younger self, what advice would you give?
Yeah. So I think going back to the, where I talked about this period that really shaped me, I think quite a bit as a person, especially the early days when I was at Oxford. I was going through a lot of grief and loss, doing a lot of painting and composing music. I went sort of back to that and writing fiction. I think I would go back and maybe tell myself to start that process a little bit earlier and, not resist it, right? Giving up some control and allowing the process to fold and realizing that things will change, even when you go through things that are really difficult, that letting yourself go through that process of feeling and acknowledging and appreciating when you are going through loss. And I think what was so important was then to stop resisting it and just, allowing myself to start painting and expressing those emotions rather than just working on my PhD thesis.
Wise advice. And then finally, if you could write a slogan on a giant billboard with your message for the world, what would it say?
I would say that it should be a huge priority to include cognitive diversity because that will ultimately help us solve some of our biggest problems in the world.
Maureen Dunne, thank you for sharing your story, your innovative work on neurodiversity, and your vision for the future of work for all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Innovator's Journey with me, Jonathan Winter. If you enjoyed today's story, do share it with your friends and colleagues and subscribe to make sure you hear future episodes. This podcast was recorded in Riverside, edited and transcribed automatically in Descript, with algorithmic music from SoundDraw and artwork generated with DALL-E. The rest was human.